Before we begin, remember this. What you learned about slavery may only be a fraction of a much larger, darker machinery. You know the Atlantic routes, the ships, the plantations, the horror we're rightly taught to remember. But imagine a system that endures not for 4 centuries, but for 14, a network that doesn't just capture bodies, but rearranges societies, erases languages, and converts suffering into measurable policy. That is the history we're stepping into tonight. Archival, legal, administrative, spanning from early conquests in the 7th century to the 20th, recorded in ledgers, decrees, and travelers' accounts that survived even when people did not. If the stories you were given felt complete, what follows will unsettle that certainty. If you sense there were gaps, the gaps are about to open. Begin, then, with a policy that turned parenthood into fear and villages into hostage rooms of silence. Picture a bell tolling, not for worship, but for warning. Officials arrive with lists and criteria. They line up boys in a square and evaluate them like they would conscripts, recruits, investments. Teeth, height, posture, mind. The shock isn't randomness. The shock is procedure. Selection standards written down, refined, repeated. The word for it echoes through time, discern, and with it, a staccato rhythm of partings. Mothers bargaining with land and livestock, fathers collapsing into dust, brothers learning that sometimes survival means disfigurement to avoid being chosen. Listen to a single case and feel how easily one life becomes a template for 10,000. A boy taken at 10. A mother's hand pushed away. A march that unspools across years. Then training, language, creed, discipline. A new name layered over an old one until the old one fades. Decades pass. And that boy, now a statesman, signs orders that send soldiers back to the villages that formed him, to the doorways that once closed on him, to the bell that once tolled for him. Power does not erase the memory. Power weaponizes it. Bridges are built that carry armies. Gifts return home as instruments of control. Even acts that look like remembrance can be routes for conquest. This is how a system announces its genius. It convinces the conquered to maintain the system itself. Where pleading failed, policy succeeded. Where resistance broke, administration endured. A village emptied of boys is a village whose harvest dwindles, whose inheritance lines thin, whose future becomes arithmetic. Within a generation, the doors hang open to dust. The tools sit rusting in fields. The church roof sags and then caves. There is no need to burn a place to end it. You can drain it of its sons and let time finish the work. Understand the rigor of selection. Intelligence tested through puzzles. Physique inspected for endurance. Health tracked like a ledger entry. Marital status matters. Lineage matters. Rural origins preferred. Everything is weighed, costed, and plotted. The breakaway tactic of desperate parents, make the child ineligible by injury, tells you the rest. If survival demands a wound, then the policy has already reached beneath the skin. Now widen the frame. The child levy is a single gear. Beyond it waits a workshop where bodies are modified to fit roles that the household and the palace, the treasury and the mosque, the market and the court all demand. The euphemism is service. The reality is permanent dependency engineered by design. The calculus is cold. Reduce threats to dynastic lines. Restrict private families among servants. Discipline proximity, and turn the most intimate parts of a person into the clearest mark of subjugation. What matters for our purpose is not to dwell on surgical detail, but to see the economic eye that supervises every step. Costs of transport, losses in transit, survival rates after procedures, resale values, and premiums paid when a transformation succeeds. You will hear numbers that feel impossible. You will be told death rates that read like misprints until you see the ledgers balancing despite them. You will watch mortality become a tolerated expense and survival an upgrade. This is the part where arithmetic becomes a weapon, where the quiet ink of accounting corrodes the loud metal of the sword. A caravan sets out with 100. Most will not arrive. The margin anticipates it. The price at destination justifies it. Where compassion would see tragedy, commerce sees throughput. That is how a market grows without mercy, yet remains stable enough to last centuries. But resist the temptation to think only in counts and ratios. The machinery runs on something harder to quantify, memory stripped and replaced. A boy separated from his language adopts the tongue of command because that is the only way to speak at all. A name is traded for a title. A prayer learned by heart as a child is forgotten, then forbidden, then unremembered. After that, loyalty is not just enforced, it is manufactured. When you take a child and teach him that honoring the new is the only path to bread, you do not merely change his behavior. You loosen the knots that tie a people to themselves. Yet even here, the world is not monochrome. Some who rose within these systems learned to steer them, gained power, commanded armies, signed decrees. You can call that triumph, or you can call it a peculiar victory that depends on what was first taken. Those who ascended did not do so as fathers of households or owners of their own names, but as instruments so valuable the state kept them close. This is the grand paradox of the empire. It prizes what it first broke, then polishes it until it gleams. Remember this opening movement as a prelude. The bell in the village, the line in the square, the criteria on parchment, the march away, the training that replaces memory, the return as officer, as administrator, as ornament of a regime that can point back at a childhood and call it recruitment rather than loss. If you feel an ache where a biography should be good, that ache is the mark of what has been omitted in official histories. If you feel anger where a footnote used to sit, better. Anger is a sign that the silence is finally cracking. We have started with children because systems reveal themselves most clearly in what they demand of the smallest and the least protected. If you can take a son and refashion him for the uses of the state, then what can you not take? If you can transform a village by removing its future, then what monument cannot be raised upon the emptiness that follows? This is where the story turns from a single policy to an entire economy of bodies and fates, where survival curves and price tables meet corridors of marble and chambers of gold. Stay with me. The ledgers are about to open. And before we step deeper, a word for those who choose to walk alongside difficult history. If you value truth over comfort, if you prefer the whole to the flattering part, then remain. There is more to see, there is more to hear. And if, along the way, you find the courage to keep listening, know this. Your presence helps restore names where records wrote only numbers, helps return breath where the archive offered only statistics. Continue with us. The silence of centuries is beginning to speak. Now we cross a threshold from taking children to converting men into instruments through alteration, proximity, and rule. Imagine a chain of stations along desert roads and river bends where arrivals are counted, losses noted, and the next step decided by a supervisor with a quill. Think of mortality not as accident, but as a forecast baked into prices. From certain regions, a portion will falter before they reach the city. From others, the first culling happens in the place where bodies are prepared for palace or household or administration. Records survive that convert this cruelty into columns. Purchase costs, transport risks, fees paid, resale gains. It feels obscene to call it an industry, yet the paperwork refuses any other name. Do not search here for sensational detail. The method's essence is the logic, not the gore. Render a person unable to form a private lineage, and you convert his devotion entirely into public service. Combine that with literacy, arithmetic, trusted access, and you have the perfect steward, present at thresholds where wealth and power live, but unable to found a dynasty that might rival the one he serves. The death rate is not a flaw to be corrected. It is tolerated attrition. The few who survive are rare, expensive, dependable. In such an economy, tragedy is not a deterrent. It is a filter. From the south and east come long files of captives who will be sorted. Some for labor too heavy to last, some for training that makes a tool of the mind, some for roles that watch over hidden chambers and treasure rooms. From the north and west come others, selected in different ways, valued for different reasons. Across the sea, across the dunes, across mountain passes, they travel to ports and markets with names we still speak. Cairo, Damascus, Basra, Cordoba, where architecture glows while the human cost remains shadowed in courtyards and side streets. The contradiction is complete. Beauty above, ledgers below, domes that catch the sun, and rooms where the sunlight is never allowed. In this same era, a revolt teaches the empire a lesson it will not forget. In marshlands heavy with salt and heat, laborers forced into impossible work rise up, and for years they seize ground, hold cities, build a counterorder. You can feel the tremor this sends through the administrative heart. After that, surveillance tightens, commanders adjust. Rebellions are treated not as aberrations, but as scenarios to be modeled and prevented. The outcome is crushing, and the memory is managed. Yet the echo lingers, a reminder that even the most perfected system encounters those moments when the human refuses to be only a unit of output. Shift now to the routes themselves, because the landscape is a co-conspirator. The Sahara is not simply a backdrop, it is an instrument. A crossing with few wells and many risks is a corridor where the weak become losses and the survivors arrive worth more. You will encounter reports that list expected attrition as calmly as they list caravan loads. You will hear of waterholes ringed with bones, of waypoints that are both lifelines and judging posts. The ocean routes mirror this. Monsoons, reefs, currents that aid or ruin a voyage. Every geography that should inspire awe becomes a test that some are not meant to pass. And yet the markets flourish because they do not require every traveler to arrive, only enough. The prices adjust upward to cover those who fell. The demand persists for soldiers and porters, clerks and guards, attendants and intermediaries. The paradox sharpens. The same institutions that sponsor learning, translate science, and cultivate arts also sponsor a trade that treats human breath as freight. Libraries preserve ancient texts. Courts debate philosophy. Poets refine language. And, not far away, somebody balances a ledger where a life is an entry with a value that changes after a procedure, after a journey, after an inspection. What does that inspection look like? It is clinical, health-checked, skills demonstrated, temperament inferred. Those chosen for service at thresholds, near rulers, treasurers, and households, are assessed for reliability, not just strength. Those chosen for fields and quarries are measured for endurance. Those chosen for inner corridors are assessed for obedience beyond doubt. Every selection uses a rule that discloses a worldview. People are not people, but categories that match needs, risks, and expected returns. Remember, too, the psychological economy that accompanies the financial one. A child who is separated from his language. A teenager taught to speak so that every new word overwrites an old memory. A man who learns that trust is a narrow bridge he can walk only in one direction. These are not footnotes. They are the core. Some will rise, yes. Some will flourish according to the terms available to them. Titles, robes, seals pressed into wax. But watch closely. What was taken at the beginning shapes what can be given at the end. A brilliant steward can be trusted with a vault, yet never with a family. A loyal guard can be admitted to the most private doorways, yet never to a home of his own. The story invites you to feel outrage, and you should, but also ask for cold-eyed attention. Do not let the heat of horror keep you from seeing structure. A system that expects attrition and monetizes survival will not collapse simply because it is cruel. It will endure because it is efficient. To contest it, one must understand the places where efficiency fails. Supply lines that are too long, rebellions that cost more than suppression saved, taxes that provoke conversions that shift the social base. We are approaching those fiscal instruments next. And when you see how numbers turn into pressure, you will recognize a different kind of chain. Before we turn that page, hold on to a single principle. When suffering is turned into a table of expected losses and future gains, memory must work harder. Names will be rare in the records. Numbers will be common. Narrative will be scarce. Inventory plentiful. That is why we tell these stories aloud. To convert again what commerce flattened. To restore possibility where policy wrote only outcomes. We have traced lines from village squares to recruiting grounds, from coastal entrepôts to inner courts. Ahead lie the columns of a balance sheet that make people change their faith for bread and inherit the consequences for generations. If your heart is tired, breathe. If your mind is clear, proceed. The math is waiting. We arrive at taxation, quiet, relentless, precise. Conquest does not always need a siege. It can rend a people from itself by arithmetic. Imagine a family's harvest, measured, recorded, reduced. Imagine a rate that takes more than the margin and leaves less than survival requires. Imagine an additional impost layered upon identity itself, payable in coin and humiliation. If the levy is low, it funds administration. If it rises, it buys conversions. The rates we face here are not small corrections. They are instruments. When 70 of every 100 measures of grain leave your granary, the remaining 30 must feed 8 lives and seed the next year. Numbers do not need swords to cut. They can do it with ledgers. The ceremony that collects identity-based tax becomes theater. A man kneels, a blow falls, a formula is recited, a receipt is issued. The audience is his own child. The lesson is not about money, it is about place. Some men endure, others calculate and decide. If dropping one marker of identity means the entire family eats, then the choice, however painful, looks like rescue. But laws surrounding inheritance then close a trap. The son who converted cannot inherit from the parents who did not, and wealth moves along new paths. Survival today, dissolution tomorrow, an equation that works without shouting, without banners, without a battle line in sight. Extend this from households to towns. Increase the rate for a district. Watch what happens. Protesters gather. They're dismissed. They arm. They are punished. The record will note the suppression as routine. Population tallies will shrink. The tax burden will continue for those remaining, now under stricter rules. Within a few years, the place that once held 500 holds 50. The fields go to seed. The young leave if they can. The old die where they stand. This is not a catastrophe like a flood. It is a managed decline like a drought imposed on purpose. Across centuries and regions, the pattern repeats. Rates rise by increments until prosperity can no longer reproduce itself. Trade restrictions push artisans to the margin. Segregations confine opportunity to smaller and smaller plots of life. Property cannot be held peacefully without entanglements that consume it upon death. Even houses of worship require special payments to repair their own walls. A craftsman learns a hard lesson. The only way his son can thrive is to adopt the identity that lowers the burden. In this way, doctrine is not argued into being, it is budgeted. You may ask, why not revolt? Some did. We have seen what followed: suppression, confiscation, punitive surcharges. The rulers learned an even surer method: make the rate survivable but crushing. People who are one bad season from hunger will not leave the fields to fight. They will cling to the harvest while the collectors measure and carry it away. A few generations of this, and the memory of how things once were becomes a story, then a rumor, then nothing. People do not always need to forget. Sometimes they simply run out of breath to say the words. The most devastating outcome is arithmetic compounded across time. Consider two families, one paying a light burden, one paying a heavy one. The first buys tools, teaches children, amasses a cushion against drought. The second sells tools, pulls children from learning to labor, and lives at the edge where any mishap means debt. 10 years pass. The gap is an open canyon. 50 years, the canyon is a continent. When the elder dies, the light-burdened family transfers wealth intact. The heavy-burdened family sees its estate dissolved by fees and rules. What looks like a tax code is, in truth, a map of cultural survival. Now we shift from economics to culture itself, because after extracting grain and coin and breath, the next target is memory. A language once used for contracts is barred from the courts. A language once used in the marketplace becomes suspicious. A language that retreats to homes and prayers will soon, with each generation choosing opportunity over sentiment, retreat from the tongue entirely. In such a scheme, The last native speaker does not know she is the last until the day she realizes no child around her can answer in the old words. When she dies, a 5,000-year thread ends in a quiet room. Before temples fall, fires go out. Before libraries burn, access narrows and catalogs disappear. Before monasteries are emptied, the scholars are dispersed. Sometimes destruction is sudden. Doors broken, statues toppled, archives carried away in carts. Sometimes it is administrative, permissions denied, repairs forbidden, endowments seized, teaching restricted to whispers. Both roads end at the same cliff. The building remains in stone, but the life inside it is gone. Or the stones themselves are carted off to raise another's monument. Either way, the result is absence of practice, of books, of memory, of people. If this feels abstract, descend to a single institution with shelves upon shelves of manuscripts, a place where young scholars memorize, debate, and copy. Now see flames printing themselves into the air for months. See ash falling like slow black snow. Or consider a complex that has kept a flame burning for generations. Watch as water quenches it in ritual unmaking while the faithful are forced to stand and witness. Elsewhere, an idol is shattered and set into steps so that every foot that climbs will grind fragments of a once holy face. There is no subtlety in a message like that. There is only the certainty of conquest turned into architecture. By now you sense the pattern. People turned into inventory. Resistance turned into cautionary tales. Numbers turned into instruments. Culture turned into quarry. The pieces fit with an engineer's precision. And still, within the ruins, small acts survive. Pages smuggled out. Lines taught in secret. A tongue preserved in a liturgy recited by a few. That these embers persist is a miracle. That they are needed at all is an indictment. We have not yet touched the most intimate part of the system, the one that reorganizes households at scale and writes purchase orders for what should never be for sale. We will not need graphic detail to recognize the design. The bureaucracy speaks well enough for itself. In palaces, in compounds, in houses made to impress, you find registers, schedules, and rooms laid out to enforce obedience and dependencies that cannot be broken. That chapter is next. Walk there with care. The accounting does not pause simply because the subject is painful. In fact, here the columns multiply. Enter the inner quarters where power rests behind curtains and a new set of rules dominates. Procurement documents exist. Inventories exist. The language is crisp, administrative, and chilling. Entries that reduce people to origin, age, condition, and price. These are not fantasies of luxury. These are institutions of control. The perimeter is physical, guards, doors, corridors. The perimeter is also legal. Ownership written as dominion, consent erased by the very definition of property. Within these walls, hierarchies are strict. Competition is constant. Despair is common. Some are elevated if fortune and favoritism align. More vanish into the daily routine of obedience and surveillance. Ports and markets specialize, responding to tastes that should never be spoken of as commerce. The flow is steady. Caravans from steppe and mountain, routes from the Black Sea littoral, desert roads converging on coastal entrepôts. Ages cluster in narrow bands because the system prizes those who can be shaped and managed. Origins are assigned premiums according to beauty standards written nowhere official yet obvious on every page of sales. Some observers who tried to intervene found themselves staring at a legality that shielded the practice. Others recorded what they saw and then spent the rest of their lives trying not to remember it. In the greatest courts, numbers expand. A ruler's compound can hold hundreds, even thousands. Documents show acquisition by lots, vetting by intermediaries, and payments made in sums that make clear how embedded this is in the fiscal heart of a state. Deaths are recorded with the same detachment as purchases. Punishments appear as standard. The words are brief because the bureaucracy does not need adjectives. It needs only proof that procedures were followed. If you listen from the guest quarters, the sound carries. If you write it down, you cipher it. If you're asked later, you say nothing. Consider how such a system interacts with lineage. A child born within may be acknowledged or erased, raised to rank or folded back into servitude, accepted as an asset or treated as a danger. The uncertainty itself is a form of governance. Some families far from the court face a nightmare calculus: how to protect a daughter in a world where demand converts beauty into risk. The lengths to which people go to shelter their children reveal the terror of capture. The songs that survive from those communities carry a grief so deep it passes for myth until you read the corresponding sales ledgers and realize it is history. The geography of trade responds. A stronghold is taken and an entire regional pipeline shifts hands. A steppe is pacified and a port thrives. A coastal city is ringed with new walls and taxes and fees rise to shield the lucrative exchange that happens beyond them. European emissaries pass through and record markets where the hum of bargaining is indistinguishable from everyday commerce until you attend to what is being purchased. It is tempting to say this was a different age with different norms. Yet within the same centuries there were voices that called it what it was, even if they learned to write those words with their careers and lives in mind. The scale is what finally overwhelms. Years compounded into centuries, ports that operate for generations, households that build entire administrative calendars around acquisition, training, and assignment. There is a straightforward, devastating reason why you do not meet multitudes of descendants. Men were prevented from forming lines. Women were absorbed into places where their children belonged to someone else. Transport and labor killed those who might have carried family memory forward. Diasporas do not form when succession is blocked and breath is short. History without descendants becomes a rumor, then a debate, then a course no department offers. And that brings us to silence as policy. You might ask, if so much is recorded, why is so little taught? The answer has many parts, some as mundane as curriculum inertia, some as dangerous as threats and pressure. Funding shapes departments. Departments shape syllabi. Syllabi shape what a generation reads. Archives require permits. Permits can be delayed. Films need distributors. Distributors need advertisers and governments to be untroubled. A scholar veers to safer topics, not always because the evidence is weak, but because the walls that guard the evidence are high and watched. It is important here to be exact. The claim is not that nothing is written, nor that nobody studies. The claim is that the proportion is wildly skewed, that the topics most likely to be supported are those that do not embarrass living power, and that the ones that would struggle to appear. You can test this with course catalogs, with publication lists, with program budgets. You can test it with the discomfort that surfaces when a proposal includes words the gatekeepers would rather not see in a prospectus. Silence is not absence, it is management. So when the story turns to memory, understand why it must be audience-driven. If parents and grandparents are gone, if liturgy is all that remains of a tongue, if the users of a script can only guess at a lost pronunciation, then the work of recall shifts to those who are neither descendants nor direct inheritors. You and I become the custodians of what might otherwise fall between library stacks and legal codes, documentaries never funded and grants never awarded. We become, in effect, the jury still willing to read evidence the world pretends not to see. Before we close, return for a moment to a city breached by armies that had no mercy to spare. The compound is opened. Those inside face a fate they can neither negotiate nor survive. The chroniclers, usually unflinching, grow vague. Archaeology fills an arrest. The ledger that once recorded acquisition has no column for release. The final entry is erasure. Even in conquest, there are rules of treatment for those who held rank, unless their rank was built on captivity. Then the sword does not distinguish. The ground is seeded with anonymity. We have now walked through the rooms few want to enter, not to sensationalize, but to understand how design and law, appetite and administration made what should be impossible into routine. The last door to open is the one that leads back out to classrooms, parliaments, newspapers, studios, to the modern places where this history is acknowledged or refused. That is where the story ends, not in despair, but in a choice. Stay with me for one more turn. Everything we have followed, child levies, altered bodies, lethal routes, punitive tax codes, cultural erasures, inner compounds run by paperwork, interlocks. Each piece feeds another. Soldiers taken as boys later command raids that capture more. Alteration creates attendants whose loyalty is guaranteed by design. Trade corridors monetize attrition. Fiscal policy buys conversions and prevents inheritance. The destruction of libraries, temples, and languages erases witnesses who might one day testify. The inner quarters consume those for whom no public life is permitted, while the bureaucracy keeps its records with impeccable penmanship. Numbers accumulate. Hundreds of thousands of children taken across centuries. Millions processed through procedures that most did not survive. Millions more driven across deserts and seas with death rates that read like a verdict. Add those lost to raids that supplied the market, those who died resisting, those never born because their parents were carried away. The sum is not a statistic to memorize. It is a reckoning to feel. It is a slow apocalypse stretched thin enough to look normal if you refuse to count, and undeniable once you do. Why does such a system endure so long? Because it is adaptive. When open war is expensive, economic pressure does the work. When public memory is inconvenient, curricula are shaped to exclude it. When law forbids one practice, an outsourcing workaround is invented. When a revolt exposes a weakness, surveillance tightens and the ratios are recalibrated. Efficiency is the true ideology here, not a claim of holiness or heritage, but a quest to keep the machine running. That is what should chill you most, the way cruelty can become logistics and logistics can become tradition. You may ask, if the evidence exists, archives, legal codes, traveler accounts, diplomatic notes, excavation reports, why the void in public knowledge? The answers range from the predictable to the perilous. Donors prefer flattering narratives. Institutions avoid topics that threaten relationships. Politicians count votes and oil barrels. Editors protect advertisers. Producers calculate risk. Scholars watch what happens to colleagues who touch electrified wires and decide to publish on architecture instead. None of this requires a grand conspiracy. It only requires incentives aligned against illumination and a little fear. So where does that leave us? With agency. You can read. You can demand courses. You can ask museums why one story has galleries and another a brochure. You can evaluate sources critically and still refuse to accept silence as neutrality. Most of all, you can hold two truths at once: that a civilization can nurture art and science, translate Aristotle and refine algebra, and also run trades and policies that crush lives by the million. Refusing simplified narratives is not an insult to the best in a culture. It is a defense against the worst repeating itself. There's one more comparison that explains why some histories thrive in public memory and others do not. Where descendants flourish, memory organizes, institutions form, commemorations insist. Where descendants are prevented, memory disperses, documents sleep in archives, and the past can be edited without protest. The near absence of surviving lines is not proof that nothing happened. It is proof that something happened so thoroughly its echoes were silenced. When you stand in front of a monument that dazzles, ask what is beneath it. When you tour a palace that shimmers, ask who served there and at what cost. If you have walked this far, you have earned the right to ask difficult questions of easy lessons. You have the right to be skeptical of curricula that skip 14 centuries and then assign 3 papers on a single route across a single ocean. You have the right to see funding letters and ask what strings are attached. You have the right to read a footnote and follow it into an archive until the numbers warm into people again. And you have the right, after learning, to share, because sometimes the only monument the erased receive is the story told accurately, aloud, without flinching. We close where we began, with the recognition that history is not only what is carved in stone, but what is written in ledgers and what is missing from syllabi. If tonight's journey unsettled you, that is not a flaw. It is a sign your moral instruments work. If you feel gratitude for your ordinary morning, the coffee, the commute, the quarrels that happen in safe rooms, that, too, is appropriate. There is a world in which children are not taken by policy, in which tax codes do not humiliate their payers, in which languages flourish beside one another, in which households are private and not administered by purchase orders. We live closer to that world than most humans ever did. It should make us both humble and vigilant. If you value accounts that do not look away, stay close. There are more silences to break, more archives to wake, more rooms to open, gently and carefully, until light reaches corners that power preferred to keep dim. Share what you learned, not as a weapon against the present, but as a defense for the future. The past is not a single story. It is a ledger of choices. Tonight, we added entries that have been left in the dark. Tomorrow, perhaps, someone will add more. Until then, remember, absence in the textbook is not absence in the world. And remembering, done well, is a form of justice. If you want more long-form journeys like this, slow, careful, unafraid of the hard parts, stay with us. Keep listening, keep reading, and when the time comes to speak, do not whisper.